Amen. Hebrews chapter 9. Once again, welcome to Grace. If we haven't met, my name is John. I'm one of the pastors and elders here at Grace, and it's so good to be together this morning to look to Hebrews chapter 9. If you don't have a copy of God's Word, there's one under the seat in front of you. If you don't own one, take that. Not like take that, like nah, but take that Bible as a gift from us. Sorry. All right, Hebrews chapter 9. That's my last joke of the day. It was a bad one. Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 1. Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was the second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna and Aaron's staff that budded and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. And of these things we cannot speak in detail. These preparations, having been made, the priests go regularly into the first section performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for this present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. God, I thank you for the work of Christ on our behalf, that he gave himself a ransom for many. Open our eyes this morning. Open our eyes that we may behold you. Amen. A legend has it that before modern diagnostic methods, staff at mental hospitals would perform an unusual test to assess whether a patient was well enough to be released. They would clog up a sink in the janitor's closet and turn the water on and let it overflow, and then hand a patient a mop and say, clean up the mess. And they would observe whether or not the patient would continue to just mop up the floor without turning off the sink first and then unplugging the drain. And they would determine that if the person would just address the symptoms and not the actual cause of the problem, that they were not well enough to leave. They were not well enough to be released from this hospital. Now, I don't know if that actually happened or if that's just the stuff of legend. Seems like a messy way to test it out. But it's not far from how we handle things, right? Far too often we address the symptoms without actually addressing the problem. We work to fix the symptoms, to hide the symptoms, to cover the symptoms, to change the symptoms without ever really addressing the problem. We medicate to distract ourselves instead of dealing with the thing that is really wrong within us. Instead of addressing the inner pain that we feel or the loneliness that we feel, we simply distract ourselves with food or drink or social media or even busyness. We address the symptom instead of the sickness. And it's much easier to address the symptom instead of the sickness, right? It's much easier. Addressing the sickness is a much more difficult thing to do. But if we never address the sickness, we will never actually see change. We will never actually grow. We will never actually reach the place that we need to be, and whether we like it or not, whether we want to hear it or not, if we do not address the sickness and only address the symptoms, at some point that sickness will grow and grow and grow until we cannot. We have to get to the sickness, not just the symptom. And ultimately, that is what the author of Hebrews is getting at here in chapter 9 is how do we address the sickness and not just the symptoms. See, we're in this part of Hebrews where he is looking at or presenting Jesus as the great high priest who is better than the other priests. And we began last week how he is talking about the work of Jesus. And he's comparing here the work of Jesus with the work of the old covenant priests. And what he's going to do here is show how much better Jesus is at addressing the sickness, not just the symptoms. And that's what we're going to see overall. So I just gave it to you, right? That's the whole thing, so you can relax. You're not trying to figure this out. You've got it. That's the whole message in a nutshell, that Jesus addresses the sickness where the old covenant addresses the symptoms. And so he begins here, the first 10 verses of chapter 9 are really looking at the old covenant, and he presents in here this big problem that they have. He presents the problem. He just lays that out before them. The first 5 verses. The first 5 verses here, he describes the tabernacle and what this looks like. There's this first section that the priest, the non-high priest, the regular priest, they could go into this routinely and perform their rituals where they would go in and they would mediate this worship. There was the facilitators of worship for the nation. So they would go into this first section, and then there was a second section that only the high priest could go in, but only on one day of the year under the right circumstances, following the right process. And so we see that there's this this kind of separation from the presence of God to the people, right? Because the holy place, the most holy place, the inner thing, we've seen in Leviticus 16 that is the place where the presence of God dwells. And so the high priest would go into that place once a year at one moment. He could go into that place in the presence of God. And then the other priests, they could go in more routinely, but they couldn't go into the presence of God. They could just go near the presence of God. But then you have the people of Israel, the non-priests, those of us like you and I, we would not be able to even go near the presence of God, much less into the presence of God. So the big problem that he presents here is that we do not have access to the presence of God. That our big problem is that we do not have access to the presence of God. And we know that the intent, the design from Genesis was that we, humanity, would have access to the presence of God. That we would not only have access to the presence of God, but that we would represent God here in this world. But something happened. Adam and Eve, they in their rebellion, they broke that intent. They broke that design. And with their sin increased. And as sin increased, the access to God decreased to the point where there was one room that one man on one day a year could go into his presence. We do not have access to the presence of God in this old covenant. We do not have access to the presence of God in this old covenant. And he speaks here of this high priest going into the most holy place, that second section, and he would offer up these sacrifices, and he's referencing here the Day of Atonement. You can find that in Leviticus 16. We're not going to go into that now. We went through that in March. You can go back and watch that, or you can read Leviticus 16 and see what this looks like on that day. But we're not going to go through that this morning because the author actually doesn't really go into that, because that's not the point of what he's getting at. The point of what he's getting at is not what the Day of Atonement does, but the fact that you don't have access to the presence of God. Like, you don't actually have access to the presence of God under this old covenant system. That is how faulty the old covenant system really is. Now, we may ask ourselves the appropriate question of, okay, so if the Day of Atonement is the day that our sins were atoned for, or we are forgiven in that day, and it is our sin that keeps us from heaven, right? The natural question is, how do we not have access if we have a means of atonement? Verse 9 and 10 tell us. It says that those things, that system cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with the food and drink and various washings and regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. And here we see beyond the big problem, but beyond the thing that we see the root of the problem here. We see the cause of the problem. We see the source of the problem here that they really find themselves in. The reason they continue to not have access to the presence of God, even though there is this Day of Atonement, the reason they still find themselves merely being close to the nearness of God, but not even near the presence of God, the reason they find themselves there is because it only addresses the outer thing, the exterior things, the symptoms, and not the actual problem. These washings and cleansings, they were enough for God to be close by, but not to be with. They were good enough to cleanse the outside, but not to cleanse the inside, as it says in verse 13 and 14. That it purifies the flesh, but not the conscience. It purifies the outside, but not the inside. It doesn't get to the sickness. It just kind of addresses the symptoms that are under or overshadowing what is happening deep within us. And that is the shortcoming of the old covenant. That even in their practices, even in their rituals, even in their best efforts, they still fall short of actually addressing the sickness. They only address the symptoms. They only address the outer. They only address the surface things. They don't get deep within to address what's really, really wrong. This is why Jesus looked at the Pharisees who had built all of these rules and regulations to make sure that the outside of them looked good, to make sure that they had all of these things in the right appearance, but didn't fix the internal thing. The reason Jesus looked at them and called them whitewashed tombs and looked at them and said, you're like those who clean the outside of the cup, but the inside is still filthy. The reason he did that is because he was accentuating this fact that all of these things clean the outside, but not the inside. And he was really getting at the point that you really need something or someone to clean the inside, the internal things, those things that are really the problem. But like I said, it's easier to address the symptom and not the sickness. It's easier to address these things that are on the surface and not really dig into what's underneath, what's really at the cause of this, what's really at the heart of this. And so what we do is we work a little bit harder. We try a little bit more. You see, while we are not under the old covenant system where we would bring sacrifices and offerings to the priest for him to go in on our behalf and offer them before the Lord, what we do as our participation in these gifts and offerings of the old covenant is that we try harder and we work more. Our self-effort is our way of offering gifts. Our work at this is our way of showing God that we really, really want to be right. And so we work and we try. And we don't like to think of it that way. We probably would never really, really fully admit it. But our efforts are our way of trying to appease the wrath of God against our sin. Our efforts are our way of trying to get on God's good side, right? Our efforts are our way of holding firmly to the old covenant. Our efforts are our way of addressing the symptoms and not addressing the sickness. And it's much easier, again, to address the symptom than the sickness, because what happens when I really, really have this thing changed within me? What happens then? What does that look like for the rest of my life? No, I can just kind of ignore this, and I can cover this thing, and I can hide this thing. I can do all these things to look right, to give the appearance of rightness. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say something along the lines of, man, I'm trying really, really hard to be a good person, or to do the right things, or to be this, or to not do that specific sin. And it's almost always followed up with, but man, I keep failing. Man, I keep failing. And there's this sense of sadness and defeat in their minds as they realize the weight of their insufficiency. See, at best, our self-effort can offer the appearance of righteousness, but not actually righteousness. At best, our self-efforts can offer the look of somebody who is right with God, but it cannot actually make us right with God. And what we find over and over and over is that if we treat the symptom but not the sickness, we find ourselves miserable. Miserable. And over time, that leads to just whatever. Why try? Have you found yourself there? You try your best. You work your hardest. You do what you think are all of the right things, and you find yourself falling short over and over and over again. That is because we are living in the old covenant. Addressing the symptoms and not the sickness. But when Christ appeared, as the high priest of the good things that have come then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh. Now remember, they were effective only for cleaning the outside. Verse 14, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purifying our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. In other words, what the old covenant priests and high priests could not do, Christ did. What they could not accomplish, he accomplished. What they could not address, he did address. See, they could clean the outside, but he purifies the inside. They could make you have the appearance of righteousness, but he could actually make you righteous. They address the symptoms, but he addresses the sickness. And in this is beautiful. What it looks like here in this eternal redemption that we see in verse 12. We see through the work of Christ, through his work on the cross as our great high priest who went in offering his own blood, giving himself on our behalf. What we see is that we are now freed from sin. We are freed from sin. He has set us free. The ESV Study Bible defines that word redemption that we find in verse 12 as the paid release from the bondage of sin. The paid release from the bondage of sin. And that is what he does. That is what he does for us. He purifies us and he releases us from the bondage of sin. We are freed from sin. We are not just washed and cleaned, right? That is the external wash and clean, but he releases us. The internal salvation, the addressing the sickness of it all is that he releases us. He breaks its hold on us. He undoes what the enemy has done in our lives. He releases us from sin. He doesn't just remove the filth and the guilt and the shame that come along with that sin, but he heals that brokenness within us that causes the sin. That is what he does when he frees us from sin. We are free from sin and its curse. You know what that means? You don't actually have to continue in that sin. You can have victory over that sin. We have been freed from sin. But not only does this redemption free us from sin, but it also frees us from our self-salvation, from our efforts, from our willpower. It frees us from those things that we feel we have to do in order to save ourselves. You are not freed from sin because you have worked harder, because you have tried more, you have done all of these things. You are freed from sin because of what he has done. It frees us from having to do all of these things to be our own salvation. He has purified us, as it says, from our dead works. I don't have to present my efforts and my works to God as a means of my salvation, and that is great news because my works are dead. I don't present my works. I'm freed from my self-salvation because he has already done all that is necessary. And what I love about that definition of redemption is not just that it is the release, but it is the paid release, that he paid to have us released. The reason we are freed from sin, the reason that we are freed from our self-salvation is that he has actually paid the cost. It is free to us because he has paid it. We are free from it because he has paid for our redemption. He's paid for our freedom. He has paid to bring us in. He purchased us, as it says, with his own blood. His life was poured out for our redemption. His life was given for our cleansing. He has done all that is necessary for our salvation. There's not a point where we will get to heaven and stand before God and say, okay, now look at all that I did. And have God say, oh man, good job. That's awesome. All right, I'll let you in. You convinced me. No, our only hope is that we stand before God and say, look at what Jesus did on my behalf. And the good news is that as we say, look at what Jesus did on my behalf, what we have is our great high priest who mediates this new covenant for us. We have him standing behind us saying, yep, I did that for them. I covered him. I covered her. Their sin was placed on me. I got it. We don't hold our righteousness forward, but his. I was reminded this week of the story that I've heard many times of an evangelist in the early 20th century who was at the end of a tent revival, and he was busy cleaning up after the revival was over, and this young boy who had been in attendance at the revival came forward to the evangelist and said, "Sir, what do I have to do to be saved?" And the evangelist barely looked up from his busyness and said, "It's too late. You're too late." And the boy, kind of taken aback, said, "You mean I'm too late because the service is over?" And the evangelist looked at him and said, "No, son, you're too late to do anything. Jesus has already done it all. All you can do is believe. He's done everything." See, friends, he saves us. He frees us from our efforts because he purchased us with his blood. His blood not only washes the outside and addresses the symptoms, but it goes deep within and purifies and cleanses and heals the sickness that is within us. That is what makes his work so much better than theirs. He can do what they can't do. And so as we look through the scriptures, as we read the scriptures, we not only come to this, we should not only come to this through the lens of learning more content about the scriptures and what this all looks like, but learning the intent of what the scriptures are desiring. What does the author really want his audience to not only know, but to do with this? What are they supposed to take away from this and apply to their lives, right? Because this isn't just an intellectual endeavor. It is about a life change. It's not just about learning that Jesus does something. It's about having him actually affect that change on the depths of who you are. So what do we do with this? What I believe the author of Hebrews is really getting at here, what he really wants them to see is first and foremost, he wants them to have this beauty, this vision of the beauty of Jesus, to see his majesty and see his glory, to see his greatness, to understand his love for them, that he would offer himself for them. That's the first and foremost that he wants them to see, is that, hey, these men would go in and offer the blood of something else, but he offered himself. He gave his very own blood. Charles Spurgeon said, he offered himself. What a splendid word that is. Did he offer his blood? Yes, but he offered himself. Did he offer his life? Yes, but he specially offered himself. The entire Christ was offered by Christ. He offered himself. You cannot put it so strongly by the use of any other word. He gave himself, not his life on earth, not his life in heaven, nor his abilities and his thoughts and his works, but he gave himself. He gave himself to purchase our redemption, to heal the sickness that is within us so that we have access to the very presence of God. That is what the author of Hebrews wants them to see, is the beauty of the work of Christ on your behalf, that he can do what nothing else can do. He can do what nothing else can do. Friends, if we do not have that big of a vision of the work of Christ, then we will constantly be working to cure and to cover the symptoms and never address the sickness. But when we have a vision of the work and the scope and the magnitude of his work on our behalf, we can trust that he will heal the sickness, not just the symptom. First and foremost, we see a big, huge vision of his work on your behalf. Not just the sins of the world, but my sins. That is the first intent, is to give you the vision of how big his work is. The second intent is he wants them to cling to Christ's work on their behalf and let go of the old covenant work. That this was insufficient because it could only address the symptom. This is sufficient because it heals the sickness. The intent is that we would let go of that and cling to his work. Friends, for you and I, what this looks like is that we let go of effort. We let go of our work. That does not mean we let go of obedience, but that means we let go of our efforts to self-save. That we are not working to justify ourselves, but rather we apply the gospel to our lives. That we apply the gospel to our lives. And the difference is that applying the gospel to our lives addresses the sickness, not the symptoms. See, our self-effort addresses the sickness. The gospel addresses the sickness. The effort, symptoms, gospel, sickness, right? So just remember that. That's how we do this. See, I want to give you an example, just something like maybe you can just really wrap your mind around and really hold on to and learn to apply the gospel to your life in a way that will help to heal the sickness in your life and not just the symptoms. See, some of us are tempted to lie, right? Not all of us, and I'm not asking you to raise your hand and admit that you're tempted to lie. And if I did, some of you would lie by not raising your hand. But anyways, we are tempted to lie sometimes, right? And addressing the symptom is easy. The self-effort is easy. Don't lie. That's easy, right? Just don't lie. Like I have control of the words that are coming out of my mouth, right? I cannot lie. That is the easy thing. But really preaching the gospel to yourself and applying the gospel to your life and really seeing the gospel transform who you are is not just not lying. It is going underneath and saying, why did I want to lie? What was it within me that I needed to lie? What was that thing that I wanted this person to believe about me that would cause me to lie so that they would see me in that way? What is that thing? And when we find that thing, what we do then is we say, God, I choose to believe the gospel over this lie. I choose to believe what you say about me rather than what I want them to believe about me. I choose to believe that I am loved, that I am chosen, that I have been redeemed, that I have been purchased, that I am so valuable to you that you gave yourself for me. And I don't need them to believe anything else about me because I believe what you say. That is how you apply the gospel to address the sickness and not just self-effort to address the symptom. Too often we settle for addressing the symptom and we ignore the sickness. And that, my friends, is why so many of us are burnt out. That is why so many of us are complacent. That is why so many of us are apathetic because we see over and over and over that addressing the symptom does not cure the sickness, and the sickness is eating us up inside. But when Christ appeared as our high priest, he didn't just address the symptom, but the sickness. He has set us free by his own blood. And the more we can apply the gospel to our lives, the more we will see transformation within us. The more we will see the sickness changing, the sickness getting better, the sickness going away. The more we will see ourselves becoming like Christ. That, my friends, is the goal of Hebrews 9. It's not just to see that the old covenant was faulty, but the new covenant's good, but to get a huge vision of the scope of Jesus' work on our behalf and then to cling to that work as our only hope. That is what the author of Hebrews wants us to do. What are you clinging to? What are you clinging to? Your work or his?